We are back, and we are joined now by Ashley Dawson, professor of English at the CUNY Graduate Center and at the College of Staten Island, author of Environmentalism From Below, How Global People's Movements Are Leading the Fight for Our Planet. Ashley, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Emma. It's great to be with you.
Oh, great to be with you as well on Earth Day, right? I mean,
That's
there
right.
you go. What better time to have a conversation about the battle to combat climate change and environmentalism more broadly, which I think, you know, to dive into what you discuss in your book, by its nature, it should be communal, right? Because this is our communal planet. And yet, as we know, the global south bears the brunt of climate change's worst effects, and the western, you know, the global north, the countries like the United States are disproportionate, have played a disproportionate role in producing those worst effects. So, I mean, I guess talk a bit about that contradiction and how important that is to your analysis.
Absolutely. Well, so, you know, the main point that my book is trying to make is that there is a world system that for a long time, 500 years basically, as a result of colonialism and capitalism, has been rampantly unequal. And the climate crisis happens within that broader context. That means, as you pointed out, that the impact of the climate crisis is worst in the countries that have historically been on the receiving end of the most blatant forms of colonization and capitalist exploitation. That is, countries that are now in the global south, as we would call it. It means that the global north countries have benefited from not only exploiting those countries, stealing their resources, but also from polluting the atmosphere, which is a kind of commons for almost 500 years, pretty much unchecked. And so now, as we begin to think about solutions and we really try and cope with the climate crisis, we need to take that history into consideration, because there's no getting out of the climate crisis without also making sure that solutions can consider the people of the global south and in fact come from the people of the global south. We really need, as activists, to be thinking about what the global south needs to do to transition away from the really deadly circumstances that it's in. And unfortunately, that's not what's happening, right? Even the most kind of radical proposals, like the Green New Deal proposals coming out of the US and the European Union countries, tend to only think about ecological transition on national terms, in relation to rich countries. And that means that some of the proposals, for instance, for energy transition, can unwittingly spark off a whole new form of colonization, through like efforts to extract lithium in countries like Bolivia and Argentina. So, while we really do need to be thinking about how to change our circumstances in places like the US, we also need to be listening to what activists in the global south are saying, because unless we think about this on a planetary scale, the entire planet is doomed.
I think that you hit on the fact that, colonialism and that analysis has taken a backseat is so central to not just, honestly, our analysis of the climate crisis, but and solutions in that way, but really our entire world at this moment. I think we're moving away from a bit of a Cold War global analysis that was insufficient at the time, but kind of a heterodox way of thinking, especially in Western countries, to some of the more left-wing forward-thinking members or thought leaders or politicians beginning to transition towards a colonial emphasis, where it's about nations that extracted and nations that were extracted from, and yet still we are decades behind that being general consensus, and that's what would be sufficient, I would say, to meet the moment in the way that you're describing.
Yeah, it's a dark Earth Day, to be honest.
Right.
We are at the hottest span of years in recorded human history. Last month was the hottest month recorded. At any time you come on some kind of a show, you have to repeat these kinds of things, and they're very, very upsetting. But we also need to acknowledge that there are two massive colonial conflicts going on, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and, of course, with the genocide unfolding in Gaza with US support. And all of that is leading to massive carbon emissions. So we have these increased geopolitical tensions that are so upsetting and causing so much conflagration right now in US society, and that are just symptomatic of a much broader set of inequalities that really need to be rectified. And in my book, I talk about the People's Conference in 2010 in Cochabamba, where we really tried to argue for some alternative path forward.
That was going to be my next question, because you speak about that really at the beginning of your book, and how you actually worked with Evo Morales, which was interesting to hear about. Speak a bit about your experience in Bolivia during that time period, and how you kind of witness what you describe as environmentalism from below, also your book title.
Yeah, so I was fortunate to be part of a delegation of environmental justice activists from the US and from New York specifically, who were invited by Evo Morales and his government in Bolivia in 2010 to go to a World People's Conference that could be a kind of alternative to the failed United Nations climate conferences, which way back then and still today really haven't produced anything tangible, right? Carbon emissions continue to go up. Any kind of binding agreements have been just set aside, and everything is purely voluntary. And so we saw that happening in 2010, and Evo Morales and many others called for a kind of bottom-up grassroots meeting of people to try and fight for alternatives. And the accord which came out of our meetings, which was achieved through really wonderful direct democratic conversations with activists from all over the world, I think still is the kind of horizon for movements fighting for climate change. It calls for climate reparations from rich countries to global south countries that could help them adapt. And also it calls, of course, for the rich countries to massively cut their emissions, which they still to date have not done. And it also includes a whole series of other kinds of proposals, including what I close my book with, and that's the idea of the right to move as a form of climate adaptation, acknowledging that the rich countries of the planet have polluted the atmosphere, are creating a lot of the crises that make it hard for people to stay in place in global south nations. And therefore, we need to figure out how to challenge border imperialism and the increasing militarization of our societies and give people who are displaced harbor in our relatively rich countries.
Can you talk a bit more about that? Because I think most people probably don't see the connection between borders and climate change. But this is kind of the new frontier of fascism, far-right politics throughout, Europe and North America, honestly, where there's this real emphasis on keeping people out. But we know that global climate migration generally, because of the conditions you describe, it's only going to increase. And so I'm quite troubled by this seemingly kind of bipartisan, in different countries as well, consensus about border militarization.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely horrendous. And, I should say that most of my book, and again, this reflects the arguments made by movements, global movements, and particularly global south movements, most of my book is devoted to helping people figure out how to adapt to the conditions they confront and actually stay in place. That's what the vast majority of people want to do in global south nations. But scientific reports have shown that it's going to get increasingly difficult going forward. In my final chapter, I talk about one recent study that says that something between a third to half of humanity is going to be living in conditions that make it very, very difficult to continue to grow crops and to continue to survive in those environments. In most cases, that means that people are going to be displaced internally, within their nation states, or from one global south state to another. But what's happening is that sort of scaremongers and fascists in the rich nations, like Giorgia Meloni, for instance, the fascist prime minister of Italy, which is a kind of frontline country between North Africa and Europe, and of course, the Trumps and other similar politicians here in the U.S. are raising fears among people that there's going to be this massive influx of refugees. And so what I talk about in the book is that the amount of promises that this country and other wealthy countries have made to help people adapt, almost none of that money has actually been delivered to global South nations. Instead, 8 to 10 to 15 times the amount of promised money has been spent on increasing the military and increasing border security and interdiction. So we find, instead of trying to help people cope and develop forms of mutual aid, because as you said at the outset, this really is about kind of communal care and finding ways to survive together. Instead of that, we find increasing militarization and violence being directed at people who are being displaced.
And the extraction that led to, even before the climate crisis, some displacement, because of course, in the United States, we destabilize countries in South America and Latin America for, to maintain our extractive abilities, undercutting leftist governments. We're kind of doing the same thing, well, maybe less overtly so, and we can't, get away with the same kind of coup tactics exactly that perhaps we could in the 20th century. But when it comes to lithium, as you mentioned, that is going to be the new frontier, based on what I guess I should pose it as a question to you. Is that the new frontier of extraction? And what are your concerns about lithium mining in South America?
Yeah, I have concerns about lithium mining in South America, about cobalt in places like Congo. All of the rare earth minerals that are so necessary for renewable energy, as well as for other contemporary forms of technology. I mean, most people by this point know that their cell phones run on cobalt that is, in many cases, mined by children under horrible conditions in Congo, right? So, our kind of squeaky clean advanced technology is connected to horrendous exploitation. And so I think we need to be really aware of that, and thinking about what energy transition and ecological restoration is really going to look like in the global north. Because it's not just happening in the global north, right? There's also a big race to find sites to mine lithium within the United States, right? Always under the kind of argument of energy sovereignty and having our own domestic sources. But that usually doesn't mean that lithium is going to be mined in Wall Street, right? It's going to be mined, in indigenous reservations in the Southwest and in the places that have historically always been sites of kind of energy sacrifice zones. So we need to very much think about how these patterns of colonialism, whether it's international or domestic, are playing out in relation to the kind of new green economies, even while we fight for energy transition, So what does that mean? It means we need to think about how we can have communal luxury, how we can change our ways of living and make them more energy efficient and more collective.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a whole separate the collectiveness of, still we're focusing on cars, right? Electric vehicles as opposed to public transportation.
Exactly.
That's the other element that is frustrating. But we could go down a whole other tangent about that. You talked a little bit about earlier how the UN-led climate efforts have been so insufficient, and this is a bit of an alternative vision. Can you give our audience some examples of how the wealthier nations have influenced some of those UN talks, and how that's altered the outcomes of global climate solidarity on that front?
Sure. Well, I mean, the clearest example is that the United Nations climate process used to be mandatory one, which, nations were, when they signed the Kyoto protocols, they were legally mandated to stick by the emission cuts that were globally negotiated. I talk about the meeting in 2010 in Cochabamba that I attended, and the kind of spark for that meeting was the Obama administration's efforts to torpedo those legally mandated climate cuts or emissions cuts, right? So the Obama administration essentially said, we can't get political agreement to have legally mandated cuts, so we need to make it voluntary. And that led to what we now have, the Paris Agreement, right? Which basically says that countries can agree to try and cut emissions and have increasing, they call it ambition, to cut back. But we've seen that hasn't happened. In fact, it was only the pandemic that led to cuts in emissions, and they've come roaring back. So a lot of what my book does is to focus on things like agriculture, urbanization, and the kind of mass movements that are bottom up, where people are fighting to change the systems that they live within and that are connected to emissions on the planet, and come up with kind of forms of environmentalism from below that are direct and democratic and genuine, since the top-down process has failed so abysmally.
And one of those are reparations, as you said. What would those reparations look like for the Global South?
Well, I think the main way in which reparations should take place is by helping countries move as quickly as possible away from fossil fuels, right? Because what's happening is that countries are seeing their possibility to have pathways towards economic development foreclosed because they're not supposed to burn more fossil fuels. They're not supposed to use coal, open up coal-fired power plants, the way the US, the European Union countries, and even China did in order to create more energy and build up economic development. And so they're seeing the hypocrisy in that, and they're refusing until they get the kind of aid they need to deploy renewables on a mass scale to go along with that. And so I would say the main way that those kinds of reparations should take place, and what we should really be fighting for, is genuine technology transfer that happens on a kind of mass scale and that is really adequately funded. And it wouldn't take that much money in comparison with the amount of money that's being spent to support fossil fuels, right? We spend something like $7 trillion a year supporting fossil fuels. So it's not as if we don't have the money. If it were just redirected to where it needs to go, it could actually happen, and it could have a really massively beneficial impact. I was born in South Africa. South Africa's been one of the kind of important countries for thinking about energy transition. It was the first country to sign into the Energy Transition Partnership that was set up 2 years ago, which was supposed to direct money to a country like South Africa to help it transition. But instead of actually giving grants and support for renewable energy technologies, what South Africa has gotten is more loans, more debt. And so now you have activists saying, we can't take any more of these loans. This whole just energy transition thing is just BS. We need to stop it. So it's really bad. We need to be aware of that, and we need to fight against that.
And I guess it's just another way for the power dynamics to reinforce themselves, as you say, because it's basically these wealthier countries saying, well, what do I get out of it? How can I use the Global South once again for extractive purposes, as opposed to just saying, hey, we need to repair, and this is our reparation.
Right, exactly. And it's about massive corruption, right? Because,
right.
The governments in the Global North want to support the big corporations in the Global North that are doing energy transition, many of which are fossil fuel companies, right? So like Equinor and Ørsted, they're all former state oil companies, but now they're doing wind turbines and offshore wind farms. And so the governments of the Global North want to give loans to Global South countries to give, development funding to those big Global North countries. But that's not going to give people in the Global South jobs. It's not going to give them the ability to develop their own kind of industrial base, and it's getting them in debt. So there's, brewing resistance to that in the global south, as well as to the kind of lithium and cobalt and other rare earth mineral extraction that we talked about earlier. So I think these things need to be seen in relation to one another.
Certainly. And I guess the finally here, the whole construction of a Green New Deal, right? I mean, the prospect of it here in the United States is a good one. I like the framing, of course, of really from what some of our leftier members of Congress, AOC and Bernie Sanders, announced it, I guess, soon after she was elected in 2018. But it does not address what you describe, which is the global impact. So how could we globalize the Green New Deal, or maybe even use that framework to take it outside of the boundaries of this country?
Well, I think the idea of a Green New Deal sparked a lot of interest in global South countries. South Africa published plans for 1 million climate jobs that were influenced by ideas of the Green New Deal. So I think people in global South countries are willing to buy in and get excited about it. I would say the main thing that needs to happen, though, is that we need to fight the kind of colonial capitalist system that is entrenching forms of debt and dependency today, right? So what does that mean in practical terms? Shouldn't be the World Bank and the International Monetary Foundation that are in charge of climate reparations, are in charge of just energy transition partnerships, because they have a whole history of imposing debt on the global South that prevents them developing and adapting to the climate crisis. So, in terms of fighting existing imperialism, that's what we need to be aware of. And I think we really need to be fighting for energy transition, significant energy transition funding for global South countries that doesn't come with strings attached.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Ashley Dawson, professor of English at the CUNY Graduate Center and at the College of Staten Island. The book is called Environmentalism From Below: How Global People's Movements Are Leading the Fight for Our Planet. Ashley, thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to your book in the description wherever people are listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm.
Thank you, Emma.